It was late October, just as the trees in Black Hollow Woods had turned a fiery blend of reds and oranges, the air crisp with the bite of early frost. I'd heard about the woods my entire life, stories passed down from generation to generation about strange sightings and sounds that no one could explain. Growing up, it was all campfire tales and ghost stories, but as an adult, the rumors still lingered in the back of my mind. The small town I lived in, nestled right at the edge of the forest, was quiet most of the year. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's business, and gossip traveled faster than the wind. But it wasn't until I lost my job at the mill that I started thinking about the woods as more than just a backdrop to our small lives. "Come on, man," my friend Jeff said, dragging his hunting gear out of the back of his truck one Saturday morning. "You've got nothing else going on. A little adventure will clear your head." It was a 2-day hiking trip, he said. Something to get us away from our problems, out in the fresh air. The idea of trudging through the forest wasn't exactly my idea of fun, but I agreed. I needed to escape the suffocating atmosphere of home, where reminders of my layoff were everywhere. We packed light, some food, sleeping bags, and our rifles. Not that we expected to need the guns, but Jeff insisted they were essential for any wilderness trip. He'd always been the practical type, the one to plan every last detail. Besides, Jeff added with a wink, "You never know what's out there." "Black Hollow has its secrets," I chuckled, dismissing his playful jab. We were adults now, too old to believe in the old tales of cryptid encounters. But as the sun began to sink behind the treetops and the woods grew darker, my skepticism began to wane. There was something unnerving about Black Hollow at night, something that tugged at the deepest corners of your mind, forcing you to wonder what lay just beyond the reach of your flashlight. The first night passed without incident. We set up camp near a small stream, roasted some marshmallows, and spent hours staring at the stars. Jeff told stories of his grandpa's time in the woods, how he once claimed to have seen a giant wolf with eyes like embers, stalking the tree line. I laughed it off, but the thought lingered as I lay in my tent, staring at the fabric above me. Then came the second night. We'd hiked deeper into Black Hollow, far beyond where most of the locals dared to go. The trees were denser here, the air thick with the smell of damp earth. We'd planned to camp near an old clearing Jeff had scouted out on a previous trip, but by the time we reached the spot, the sun had already set. "Looks like we'll have to settle here for the night," Jeff said, dropping his pack on the ground. The clearing was small, surrounded by towering pines that seemed to swallow the light of our fire. We ate dinner in silence, both of us tired from the day's trek, but something about the stillness of the woods kept me on edge. It started as a low growl, distant but unmistakable. I froze, the spoon halfway to my mouth. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Jeff nodded, his hand already reaching for his rifle. "Could be a bear," he said, but there was a tightness in his voice that made me think he didn't believe his own words. We sat in silence, listening. The growl came again, closer this time. It wasn't a bear. I knew what a bear sounded like. This was different, deeper, more guttural, like something primal. Jeff motioned for me to stay put as he stood up slowly, rifle in hand. "Stay by the fire," he muttered, taking cautious steps toward the edge of the clearing. I watched as he disappeared into the darkness, the glow of the fire flickering against the trees. For what felt like an eternity, I sat there, heart pounding in my chest, waiting for Jeff to come back, waiting for the sound of his voice to reassure me that it was all just in my head. But then I heard it, a scream. Not Jeff's scream, but something else. something inhuman. I jumped to my feet, panic surging through me as I fumbled for my flashlight. "Jeff," I called out, but there was no response. The scream came again, closer now, echoing through the trees like a banshee's wail. I shone the flashlight toward where Jeff had gone, but all I could see were shadows dancing between the trees. Suddenly, there was a rustling in the underbrush, and Jeff came stumbling back into the clearing, his face pale, eyes wide with terror. "We need to go," he gasped, clutching his rifle like a lifeline. "Now, what happened?" I demanded, but Jeff didn't answer. He grabbed my arm and started pulling me toward the path we had come from. I didn't argue. Whatever had scared Jeff was enough to send us both running through the woods in the dead of night, the beam of my flashlight bobbing wildly as we stumbled over roots and branches. Behind us, I could hear it, the sound of something following us. Heavy footsteps, crashing through the underbrush with unnatural speed. I glanced over my shoulder, but all I could see were the shadows shifting in the trees. "Faster," Jeff urged, his voice hoarse with fear. We ran for what felt like hours, the adrenaline pumping through my veins, my mind racing with thoughts of what might be chasing us. But no matter how fast we ran, the footsteps never seemed to fade. They were always there, just behind us, like a predator toying with its prey. Finally, we reached a small cave tucked into the side of a hill, a place we'd passed earlier in the day. Jeff shoved me inside, his breathing ragged as he collapsed against the wall. "What the hell was that?" I panted, trying to catch my breath. Jeff shook his head, eyes wide with terror. "I don't know. I've never seen anything like it." I peeked out of the cave, the woods eerily quiet now. But I knew better than to think we were safe. Whatever had followed us was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its moment. For hours, we sat in silence, too scared to move, too terrified to sleep. Every rustle of the leaves, every snap of a twig, sent my heart racing. But eventually, exhaustion overtook us both, and we dozed off, huddled together in the back of the cave. When I woke, it was still dark, but something was different. The air felt heavy, oppressive, and then I heard it, the low growl, so close I could feel the vibrations in my chest. Slowly, I turned my head, and there it was. A pair of glowing red eyes stared back at me from the cave's entrance, and blinking, watching. The creature was massive, its form obscured by the darkness, but the eyes were unmistakable, burning with a malevolent intelligence that sent a chill down my spine. I nudged Jeff awake, my heart pounding in my throat. "It's here," I whispered, barely able to form the words. He opened his eyes and froze, staring at the same pair of glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through the very fabric of reality. "What do we do?" I breathed, my voice shaking. Jeff didn't answer. He slowly raised his rifle, aiming it at the creature, his hands trembling. But before he could pull the trigger, the eyes blinked out, disappearing into the darkness as if they had never been there at all. We sat in stunned silence, our breath shallow, hearts racing, but the creature didn't return. When dawn finally broke, we emerged from the cave, exhausted and shaken. The woods were still, the morning light filtering through the trees like a lifeline. Whatever had hunted us through the night was gone, but the memory of those glowing red eyes would haunt me forever. We never spoke about what we saw that night in Black Hollow Woods, and I haven't set foot in those woods since. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and the shadows stretch long, I can still hear the faint echo of that low growl in the back of my mind. And I know, whatever it was, it's still out there, waiting. He opened his eyes and froze, staring at the same pair of glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through the very fabric of reality. The rusted Craigslist ad had been up for days, offering a sizable cash reward for anyone willing to help with an urgent wildlife control issue near Bear Creek. I'd been in need of extra money after the recent layoffs at the local construction company, so I reached out to the poster. The job was vague, but the reward was enough to pique my interest. "Are you sure about this?" my girlfriend, Sarah, asked, eyeing me with concern as I packed my gear. "I mean, Craigslist, Bear Creek. This sounds like a setup for a horror movie," I chuckled, trying to brush off her unease. "It's probably just some overgrown coyote problem. Nothing I can't handle," she sighed, clearly not convinced, but didn't push any further. The truth was, I wasn't exactly sure what I was walking into. The message I'd received back from the ad's poster was cryptic, asking me to meet them at an old ranger station near Bear Creek at sunset. I figured it had to be someone either desperate or just clueless about dealing with a nuisance animal. That Friday evening, I hopped into my truck and made the long drive through winding back roads, the dense woods growing thicker with each passing mile. Bear Creek was a ghost town these days, abandoned cabins, overgrown trails, and a once popular camping site that had fallen into ruin. The ranger station I pulled up to looked like it hadn't seen human presence in years. Windows shattered, the roof sagging, and thick vines creeping up the side. There was no one in sight. I checked my phone, no service, naturally, and stepped out of the truck, slinging my hunting rifle over my shoulder. The air was still, unsettlingly so. No birds chirping, no wind rustling the leaves, just silence. I was beginning to think I'd fallen for a prank when I heard the crunch of footsteps behind me. Turning, I saw a man approaching from the tree line, his face obscured by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. "You the one who answered my ad?" the man asked, his voice gravelly and low. I nodded, though something about him immediately put me on edge. His clothes were tattered, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. There was a strange smell about him, something earthy and metallic, like wet soil mixed with blood. "You didn't give much detail in your message," I said, trying to keep my tone casual. "What kind of wildlife issue are we talking about here?" The man chuckled darkly, his eyes gleaming beneath the brim of his hat. "You'll see soon enough. Follow me." Against my better judgment, I followed him into the woods. The trail we took was barely visible, overgrown with weeds and vines. The deeper we went, the more oppressive the air became, thick with humidity and the scent of decaying leaves. The sun had dipped low on the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows through the trees. After what felt like hours, we reached a small clearing by the creek. The water was murky and stagnant, barely a trickle. The man stopped at the edge of the creek, his back to me. "This is where I saw it last," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I frowned. "So what, the creature?" he muttered, turning to face me. "The thing that's been stalking these woods. It's not like anything you've ever seen before." A chill ran down my spine at his words, and I instinctively tightened my grip on my rifle. "You're talking about a bear. Maybe a wolf." The man shook his head slowly. "No, this thing, it's different, bigger, smarter, and it doesn't leave tracks. It just appears." I glanced around, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The silence was unnerving. "How do you know it'd come back here?" "It always does," the man said cryptically, his gaze fixed on the darkening tree line. "It hunts at night. It's drawn to the water." I opened my mouth to say something, but before I could, the man turned and walked away, disappearing into the woods as quickly as he had appeared. "Wait," I called after him, but there was no response. I was alone. The air had grown colder, the sun sinking fully below the horizon now, plunging the forest into darkness. My flashlight flickered as I scanned the clearing, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread. I told myself it was just nerves. There was no such thing as monsters. Cryptids were just urban legends. But then I heard it, a low, guttural growl, so deep it made the ground vibrate beneath my feet. My heart pounded in my chest as I swung the flashlight in the direction of the sound. The beam caught movement in the underbrush, something large, something fast. I raised my rifle, eyes straining to see through the darkness. Another growl, closer this time. The hairs on my arms stood on end. Suddenly, there was a burst of movement to my left, and I barely had time to react before something lunged at me from the shadows. I fired a shot blindly, the sound deafening in the still night. Whatever it was fast, too fast. The creature circled around me, staying just out of reach of the flashlight's beam. Panic surged through me as I realized how unprepared I was. I didn't know what I was dealing with. This wasn't some bear or mountain lion. It moved with a predatory intelligence, stalking me like it was toying with its prey. Then, for a brief moment, I caught a glimpse of it. A pair of glowing yellow eyes, set deep in a massive, hulking frame, its fur, or was it scales, shimmered in the faint light, and its mouth was filled with sharp, jagged teeth. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen before, some grotesque blend of wolf, reptile, and something much, much worse. I fired again, but the creature was too fast, disappearing into the woods with unnatural speed. My heart pounded in my ears as I backed up toward the creek, my flashlight flickering wildly. I could hear it moving in the underbrush, circling me, waiting for the right moment to strike. In a desperate move, I turned and sprinted down the creek, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The creature's growls echoed behind me, growing closer with every step. I had no idea where I was going, just that I had to keep moving, had to get away. The ground was slick with mud, and I slipped, crashing hard into the cold water. My rifle flew from my hands, disappearing into the darkness. Panic gripped me as I scrambled to my feet, but it was too late. The creature was on me. I felt its hot breath on my neck, its claws digging into my shoulder as it dragged me backward, pulling me toward the trees. I screamed, thrashing wildly, but its grip was like iron. I kicked and clawed, trying to break free, but the more I fought, the tighter its hold became. Just when I thought it was over, a blinding light flooded the clearing, accompanied by the roar of an engine. A shot rang out, and the creature released me with a snarl, retreating into the shadows. I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath, as a truck skidded to a stop beside me. The driver jumped out, rifle in hand, and fired another shot into the darkness. "You all right?" he called, his voice gruff but concerned. I nodded weakly, too shaken to speak. The man helped me to my feet, his flashlight scanning the tree line for any sign of the creature. "You're lucky I got here when I did. That thing's been terrorizing these woods for years." I stared at him, my mind racing. What was that thing? He shook his head, his expression grim. "No one knows. Locals call it the beast of Bear Creek, but whatever it is, it ain't natural." I shuddered, my body still trembling from the encounter. The man drove me back to the ranger station in silence, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something far worse than death. When I got home, I deleted the Craigslist ad, my curiosity thoroughly extinguished. Whatever that creature was, I had no desire to encounter it again. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear its growls in my nightmares, low, guttural, and impossibly close. The Craigslist ad was simple and vague. Fishing guide needed for Moonshadow Lake. Will pay generously. No questions asked. I'd been struggling to make ends meet ever since my fishing shop closed down. The economy had hit us hard, and while my skills as a guide were well known, it wasn't enough to keep the business afloat. So, when I saw the ad, I figured it was worth a shot. Moonshadow Lake was a 2-hour drive from where I lived, deep in the woods, untouched by tourists for decades. Locals said it was cursed, but I didn't believe in that stuff. To me, it was just another lake with fish to catch. I sent a quick reply and got a response within minutes. The client wanted to meet at the lake early the next morning, just before dawn. The message gave me an uneasy feeling. No name, no details about what kind of trip it was. But the promise of good money was too tempting to pass up. I loaded my gear into my old truck, kissed my wife, Amanda, goodbye, and promised I'd be back by the evening. She gave me a worried look but didn't say anything. We needed the cash, and I wasn't one to turn down a paycheck, no matter how strange the job sounded. The drive was uneventful, but as I got closer to the lake, the roads narrowed, and the trees seemed to close in around me. The dense woods, thick with mist, made everything feel claustrophobic. It didn't help that my GPS signal cut out an hour before I reached the destination. By the time I arrived, the sun was barely aglow on the horizon, and the air was thick with the earthy scent of moss and decaying leaves. Moonshadow Lake stretched out before me, still as glass, reflecting the dark clouds hanging overhead. There were no houses, no docks, just the lake, surrounded by dense, towering trees. A heavy fog clung to the water, swirling like something alive. The silence was deafening. I stepped out of the truck and scanned the area. The instructions had been clear. Meet at the old boathouse near the southern edge of the lake. But as far as I could see, there was no boathouse. I grabbed my gear, strapped my tackle box to my back, and made my way along the shoreline. The fog grew thicker the closer I got to the south end, and soon I could barely see more than a few feet in front of me. My heart began to pound. Something about the place felt off. The stillness wasn't natural. No birds, no insects, just dead silence. Suddenly, a voice called out from the mist, "You the guide?" I nearly jumped out of my skin, whipping around to find the source. A man emerged from the fog, his face partially obscured by the thick air. He was tall, with a heavy coat and a wide-brimmed hat that cast shadows over his features. There was something unsettling about him, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. "Yeah," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "You the client?" He nodded and motioned toward a small, rickety boat that I hadn't noticed before, tied to a rotting post just a few feet away. "Let's get started. We're losing daylight." I glanced at the sky, confused. It was barely morning, and the sun hadn't even fully risen. But before I could question him, the man was already climbing into the boat, his movements deliberate and slow. I followed, stepping into the boat cautiously as it creaked under my weight. The fog clung to us like a second skin as we pushed off from the shore, drifting into the heart of the lake. The water was unnaturally calm, not a ripple in sight, even as our boat glided over it. The man didn't speak much. He handed me a fishing pole without explanation and gestured toward the water. I figured this was just another rich recluse who wanted a quiet fishing trip without the chatter. I dealt with plenty of those types before, but something was wrong. As we drifted further from shore, I started to notice things. Strange things. For one, there were no fish. Not a single ripple, not a splash, nothing beneath the surface. I'd been on hundreds of lakes in my life, and even the most desolate ones had some kind of movement. This place was dead. And then there was the fog. It didn't move naturally. It swirled around the boat like it had a mind of its own, thickening whenever I tried to peer too far ahead. "Where exactly are we going?" I finally asked, breaking the eerie silence. The man didn't answer right away. He was staring out over the water, his eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. After what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke, his voice low and cold. "There's something in this lake. Something old." I frowned, glancing at the water. "Old like a fish." He shook his head slowly, still not looking at me. "No, not a fish. Something else. Something people have forgotten about." A chill ran down my spine. I'd heard plenty of campfire tales about cryptids and monsters lurking in the woods, but I never took them seriously. They were just stories, right? But the way this man spoke, it was like he believed it. Before I could respond, the boat jerked violently, almost knocking me overboard. I grabbed the edge, my heart racing. What the hell was that? The man didn't answer. He was standing now, staring down into the water with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "We're here," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I followed his gaze and saw nothing but darkness beneath the surface. The water was deep here, unnaturally deep for a lake this size. And then I saw it, a shadow moving beneath us, massive and slow, like some kind of underwater leviathan. What is that?" I stammered, gripping my pole tightly. The man didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. He carefully unwrapped it, revealing an old, weathered knife. Without warning, he sliced open his palm, letting the blood drip into the water. "What are you doing?" I shouted, panic rising in my chest. The man didn't respond. His blood dripped into the lake, staining the water red. And then, the shadow beneath us began to rise. At first, it was subtle, a slow, deliberate ascent from the depths. But as the minutes passed, it became clear that whatever was down there was enormous. The water began to churn, rippling unnaturally as the creature drew closer to the surface. I stood frozen, my mind racing with disbelief and terror. This wasn't possible. There was no creature this size in any lake. But there it was, coming closer, rising toward us with a purpose. Suddenly, the boat lurched again, harder this time. I stumbled, nearly dropping my pole, and looked down just in time to see something breach the surface. It was monstrous. A massive scaled head, covered in slime and algae, rose from the depths, its glowing eyes locking onto me. Its mouth was filled with rows of jagged, broken teeth, and the stench that hit me was overwhelming, like rotting fish and decaying flesh. I screamed, stumbling backward, but the man didn't move. He stood there, staring at the creature, as if he was expecting this all along. "What the hell is that?" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. "The guardian of the lake," he replied, his voice calm, almost reverent. It's been here for centuries, feeding, waiting. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This was insane. I had to get out of here. I turned, ready to jump into the water and swim for shore, but before I could move, the creature lunged. Its massive jaws snapped shut around the boat, and I was thrown into the air, crashing into the water with a splash. I struggled to the surface, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. The boat was gone, the man was gone, and the creature was still there, circling me beneath the water. I kicked and swam, desperate to get away, but the water was thick, pulling me down. The fog swirled around me, disorienting me, making it impossible to see where I was going. I could feel it beneath me, the creature's massive body brushing against my legs as it circled. It was toying with me, like a predator playing with its prey. I screamed for help, but there was no one around. No one would hear me. I was alone. The last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me was the creature's glowing eyes, staring at me from beneath the water, and then everything went black. I had always loved hiking. There was something calming about being surrounded by nature, just you, the trees, and the sound of your boots crunching over gravel and dirt. My work as a freelance photographer gave me the flexibility to take time off whenever I needed it, and I often found myself trekking through unfamiliar trails, searching for that perfect shot. But what happened on Boulder Ridge, I'll never forget. I still dream about it. It started out as just another trip. I'd read about Boulder Ridge on a hiking forum. People described it as a challenging but beautiful trail, hidden deep in the mountains of the Pacific Northwest. A little off the beaten path, sure, but that was what I liked. The more remote, the better. Fewer tourists meant fewer distractions, and the untouched wilderness was where I captured my best photos. I packed my gear the night before: camera, extra batteries, food, water, and a small tent. I had planned to camp for a night or two to really soak in the scenery. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going, just a quick text to my buddy Mark, saying I'd be out in the mountains for a couple of days. I figured I'd check in with him once I got back into cell range. The drive up was beautiful. Dense forests stretched out on either side of the winding mountain road, the morning mist rising in thin, wispy tendrils from the undergrowth. The air was crisp, and I could already smell the pine and damp earth, even with the windows rolled up. I reached the trailhead just after noon, shouldered my pack, and set off into the wilderness. For the first few hours, everything was perfect. The trail was steep in places, but nothing I couldn't handle. The forest around me was alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. Sunlight filtered through the dense canopy, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I took a few photos here and there, but I was saving the real shooting for when I reached Boulder Ridge. According to the map, there were supposed to be stunning views of the surrounding mountains from up there, especially at sunset. It wasn't until I reached the upper part of the trail that things started to feel different. The air grew colder, the trees taller, and the shadows longer. The forest here was older, more oppressive. It felt like the trees were leaning in, crowding around the narrow path, and the silence. It was unsettling. The birds had stopped singing, and even the rustling of the leaves seemed to have vanished. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just the altitude, or maybe my imagination playing tricks on me. Then I saw the cabin. I wasn't expecting any man-made structures out here. According to everything I'd read, Boulder Ridge was completely wild. No settlements, no campsites, nothing, but there it was, just off the trail, nestled between the trees. It looked abandoned, the wood dark with age, the roof sagging under the weight of moss and fallen branches. A chill ran down my spine as I stared at it. For some reason, I felt compelled to take a closer look. I left the trail, pushing through the underbrush until I was standing just a few feet from the cabin. Up close, it was even more decrepit than I had thought. The windows were shattered, the door hanging off its hinges. But there was something else, something strange. I could see claw marks gouged into the wood, deep and jagged, as if something had tried to break in. My heart started pounding in my chest. It wasn't like me to get freaked out, especially not in the middle of the day, but something about this place felt wrong. I wanted to leave, to get back on the trail and continue to the ridge, but my feet felt glued to the ground. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl, so deep it felt like it was vibrating in my chest. It came from somewhere inside the cabin, a sound so unnatural that every instinct in my body screamed at me to run. But I couldn't move. I just stood there, frozen, staring at the dark doorway. Suddenly, something moved inside, something big. I didn't get a good look, just a flash of fur and claws, but it was enough to send me stumbling backward. I turned and bolted, crashing through the trees until I was back on the trail, my heart hammering in my throat. I didn't look back, I just ran. After what felt like an eternity, I slowed down, gasping for breath. My legs were trembling, and my mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I had seen, or what I thought I had seen. It had to be an animal, right? Maybe a bear, or a mountain lion. But no bear or lion made sounds like that, and the size of the thing, it didn't make sense. I forced myself to calm down, telling myself I was being ridiculous. The cabin was old, probably abandoned decades ago, and whatever was inside was just a regular animal looking for shelter. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I continued hiking, trying to put as much distance between myself and the cabin as possible. But the deeper I went, the worse the feeling got. It was like the forest was pressing in on me, the trees whispering things I couldn't understand. Every shadow seemed to move, every rustle in the bushes made me jump. And the silence, it was back, heavier than before, like the whole forest was holding its breath. By the time I reached Boulder Ridge, the sun was already beginning to set. The view was as stunning as I had hoped, but I couldn't enjoy it. The uneasy feeling had grown into full-blown paranoia, and every time I looked over my shoulder, I swore I saw something, just a flicker of movement, a flash of fur, disappearing behind the trees. I set up camp quickly, pitching my tent on a flat patch of ground near the edge of the ridge. I didn't bother with a fire. I just wanted to hunker down and wait for daylight. But even inside the tent, with the zipper pulled tight, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The wind outside picked up, howling through the trees like a chorus of voices, and I swore I could hear that growl again, distant but unmistakable. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard something moving outside the tent, heavy footsteps, breaking branches, the sound of something sniffing the air. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting my fear get the best of me. But deep down, I knew something was out there. Just before dawn, I heard it again, the growl. This time, it was closer, much closer. My blood ran cold as I realized it was circling the tent, moving slowly, deliberately. I held my breath, praying it would go away, but the sound only grew louder. Whatever was out there, it was big, and it wasn't leaving. I grabbed the small hunting knife I always carried with me, clutching it in my shaking hands as I listened to the creature move around the campsite. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. I knew I had to do something, but I didn't know what. Running wasn't an option. Whatever was out there would catch me before I even made it down the ridge. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the sound stopped. For a few minutes, there was nothing but silence. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I was too scared to even peek out of the tent. Then, the flap of my tent jerked violently, and I screamed. I scrambled backward, pressing myself against the far side of the tent, my knife held out in front of me like it would do any good. The tent flapped slowly and zipped, and I saw a massive, clawed hand reach inside. My vision blurred as panic took over. I slashed wildly with the knife, barely grazing the creature's hand. It let out a deafening roar, shaking the entire tent, and then it was gone, crashing through the forest like a freight train. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I grabbed my backpack, bolted out of the tent, and ran. I didn't stop running until I was back at my truck, my lungs burning, my legs shaking. I threw my gear into the back, jumped in, and tore down the mountain road as fast as I could, not stopping until I was miles away from Boulder Ridge. I never went back. I don't know what was in that cabin, or what stalked me through the forest at night, but I know one thing for sure. Something lives on Boulder Ridge, and it doesn't want to be found. The Pine Barrens in New Jersey were my escape. For years, I had been drawn to the vast, eerie wilderness, the thick pine forests, the endless stretches of sandy trails. It was a place where I could be alone, far from the noise of the city and the stress of my daily life. I loved hiking there, losing myself in the solitude. But one autumn night, that solitude became something far more terrifying. I remember it vividly. The air had a crisp bite, the trees swayed in the evening breeze, and the sky was a swirl of oranges and purples as the sun set behind the dense woods. I had planned a two-day hike through an isolated part of the Barrens, a route I'd mapped out myself to avoid the more popular trails. I preferred places where I wouldn't run into anyone else, where it was just me and nature. But this time, something felt off. As I made my way deeper into the forest, the shadows seemed to lengthen unnaturally, creeping across the trail like tendrils reaching for my feet. The Pine Barrens had a reputation, of course. Legends of the Jersey Devil, the elusive, winged creature that haunted these woods, had been passed down for centuries. I'd heard the stories, but I didn't believe in such things. Superstitions were for the tourists who came to gawk at the place, not for someone like me, who knew these trails inside out. Still that night, there was something in the air, a kind of heaviness. It made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept moving, trying to shake the unease. The path I was on was narrow, winding between thick clusters of pitch pines and scrub oaks, their branches intertwined like skeletal fingers. The fading light made it difficult to see, and I regretted not starting my hike earlier. But I was determined to reach a particular campsite I'd found on my last trip, a small clearing near a creek, completely hidden from the main trails. As the last slivers of daylight vanished, I stopped to set up camp. My tent was small, just enough for me and my gear, and I quickly pitched it under the shelter of a large tree. I lit a small campfire to ward off the chill and sat back, enjoying the quiet. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the distant rustling of leaves in the breeze. It should have been peaceful, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting the Jersey Devil stories get to me. After all, I'd been out here dozens of times and never seen or heard anything unusual. But that night, it was different. As I sat by the fire, something caught my eye, a movement in the trees, just beyond the reach of the firelight. It was quick, like a shadow flitting between the trunks. I squinted, trying to make out what it was, but all I could see was darkness. My heart skipped a beat, but I forced myself to stay calm. It was probably just a deer or a fox, I told myself. The Pine Barrens were full of wildlife, but then I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a screech, high, pitched and unnatural, like nothing I'd ever heard before. It echoed through the trees, a long, wailing cry that sent chills down my spine. Every muscle in my body tensed, and I instinctively grabbed the hunting knife I kept at my side. The sound came again, closer this time, and I could hear the thudding of heavy footsteps moving through the underbrush. I stood up, my eyes scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my breath came in shallow gasps. Whatever was out there, it was big, too big to be a deer or a fox. My mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation. Maybe a black bear, I thought, but that screech, no bear made a sound like that. The Pine Barrens in New Jersey were my escape. For years, I had been drawn to the vast, eerie wilderness, the thick pine forests, the endless stretches of sandy trails. It was a place where I could be alone, far from the noise of the city and the stress of my daily life. I loved hiking there, losing myself in the solitude. But one autumn night, that solitude became something far more terrifying. I remember it vividly. The air had a crisp bite, the trees swayed in the evening breeze, and the sky was a swirl of oranges and purples as the sun set behind the dense woods. I had planned a 2-day hike through an isolated part of the Barrens, a route I'd mapped out myself to avoid the more popular trails. I preferred places where I wouldn't run into anyone else, where it was just me and nature. But this time, something felt off. As I made my way deeper into the forest, the shadows seemed to lengthen unnaturally, creeping across the trail like tendrils reaching for my feet. The Pine Barrens had a reputation, of course. Legends of the Jersey Devil, the elusive, winged creature that haunted these woods, had been passed down for centuries. I'd heard the stories, but I didn't believe in such things. Superstitions were for the tourists who came to gawk at the place, not for someone like me, who knew these trails inside out. Still that night, there was something in the air, a kind of heaviness. It made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept moving, trying to shake the unease. The path I was on was narrow, winding between thick clusters of pitch pines and scrub oaks, their branches intertwined like skeletal fingers. The fading light made it difficult to see, and I regretted not starting my hike earlier. But I was determined to reach a particular campsite I'd found on my last trip, a small clearing near a creek, completely hidden from the main trails. As the last slivers of daylight vanished, I stopped to set up camp. My tent was small, just enough for me and my gear, and I quickly pitched it under the shelter of a large tree. I lit a small campfire to ward off the chill and sat back, enjoying the quiet. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the distant rustling of leaves in the breeze. It should have been peaceful, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting the Jersey Devil stories get to me. After all, I'd been out here dozens of times and never seen or heard anything unusual. But that night, it was different. As I sat by the fire, something caught my eye, a movement in the trees, just beyond the reach of the firelight. It was quick, like a shadow flitting between the trunks. I squinted, trying to make out what it was, but all I could see was darkness. My heart skipped a beat, but I forced myself to stay calm. It was probably just a deer or a fox, I told myself. The pine barrens were full of wildlife. But then I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a screech, high, pitched and unnatural, like nothing I'd ever heard before. It echoed through the trees, a long, wailing cry that sent chills down my spine. Every muscle in my body tensed, and I instinctively grabbed the hunting knife I kept at my side. The sound came again, closer this time, and I could hear the thudding of heavy footsteps moving through the underbrush. I stood up, my eyes scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my breath came in shallow gasps. Whatever was out there, it was big, too big to be a deer or a fox. My mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation. Maybe a black bear, I thought. But that screech, no bear made a sound like that. Then I saw it, a pair of glowing red eyes, staring at me from the shadows. They were about 6 feet off the ground, maybe higher, and they blinked slowly, like whatever was watching me wasn't in any hurry. My body went cold, and I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, staring back at those eyes, unable to tear my gaze away. The fire between us crackled, casting flickering shadows, but it did nothing to illuminate the creature. It stayed just beyond the edge of the light, hidden in the darkness. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment there was silence. Then, with a sudden whoosh, something darted toward me, so fast I barely had time to react. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet and crashing to the ground. My knife fell from my hand, and I scrambled to grab it, my fingers shaking. But when I looked up, the eyes were gone. I sat there, panting, my heart pounding in my ears. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, that maybe the firelight had played tricks on my eyes, but deep down, I knew what I'd seen. Those red eyes were real, and they were still out there, watching me. I got to my feet, my legs trembling. My first instinct was to pack up and leave, but it was too dark to navigate the trail now. The thought of stumbling through the woods in pitch black, with whatever that thing was lurking nearby, was even more terrifying than staying put. I decided to stay close to the fire, figuring the light would keep whatever it was at bay. But the night only got worse. The screech came again, louder this time, and I heard branches snapping in the distance. Something was moving through the trees, circling my campsite. I grabbed a flashlight from my pack and shone it toward the sound, but the beam barely penetrated the thick woods. I caught glimpses of movement, something large, slipping between the trees, always staying just out of sight. For hours, it toyed with me. It would move closer, then retreat, screeching and snarling like some kind of nightmarish predator. I could hear it breathing, a deep, guttural sound, and every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of those red eyes, watching from the shadows. I stayed by the fire, clutching my knife, my mind racing with fear and confusion. What the hell was this thing? Was it the Jersey Devil? Or something else? Something even worse? The hours dragged on, and the creature never let up. Every time I thought it had gone, it would come back, its eyes glowing in the darkness, its footsteps heavy and deliberate. I didn't sleep at all that night. I couldn't. All I could do was sit there, my body tense, waiting for whatever it was to make its move. When dawn finally broke, the screeching stopped. The forest was quiet again, almost too quiet. The first rays of sunlight pierced through the trees, casting long shadows over the campsite, and I finally allowed myself to relax, just a little. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, my hands still trembling from the adrenaline. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I just wanted to get out of those woods and back to civilization. The hike back to my car was a blur. I moved as quickly as my legs would carry me, constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see those glowing eyes following me. But the creature never showed itself in the daylight. By the time I reached my car, I was drenched in sweat, my nerves frayed. I threw my pack into the trunk and drove away as fast as I could, not daring to look back at the forest. It's been months since that night, and I haven't been back to the Pine Barrens. Every time I think about hiking there again, I remember those eyes, that screech, and the way the creature circled my camp, playing with me like a cat with a mouse. I don't know if it was the Jersey Devil or something else entirely, but I do know one thing. There's something in those woods. Something ancient, something dangerous, and it's still out there, waiting for its next victim.